The blood-soaked wedding dress hanging in the closet would be the first thing Detective Paul Harris noticed when he entered the Jacksonville apartment where Araceli Mendoza's American dream had transformed into her final nightmare. The white silk gown, carefully preserved in plastic since her marriage ceremony 18 months earlier, now bore dark crimson stains that told a story of shattered trust, explosive jealousy, and the devastating consequences of seeking emotional connection in a marriage that had become a prison of isolation and cultural misunderstanding. Araceli Mendoza had arrived in Florida with hopes that burned as bright as the tropical sun over her native Manila, carrying dreams of building a new life with Stephen Miller, the American truck driver who had promised her love, security, and the opportunity to escape the economic struggles that had defined her existence in the Philippines. The online courtship that had blossomed over months of video calls and romantic messages had convinced her that she was embarking on a fairy tale journey to a better future, where her gentle nature and optimistic spirit would find perfect harmony with a man who seemed to understand her deepest desires for family, stability, and genuine affection. The marriage visa process had been lengthy and complicated, requiring extensive documentation and interviews that scrutinized every aspect of their relationship, but Araceli had approached each requirement with patience and determination, viewing these bureaucratic hurdles as necessary steps toward the life she had always imagined for herself. Her family in Manila had expressed concerns about marrying a stranger from a foreign country, but Araceli's conviction that Stephen represented her path to happiness had overcome their reservations, leading to tearful farewells at Ninoy Aquino International Airport as she boarded the flight that would carry her toward what she believed would be perpetual joy. The early weeks of their marriage in Jacksonville had seemed to validate Araceli's optimism, as Stephen appeared attentive and caring, introducing her to American customs, while expressing interest in learning about Filipino culture and traditions that had shaped her worldview. He had helped her find employment at a local store, where her friendly demeanor and willingness to work hard quickly earned appreciation from customers and colleagues, providing her with both financial independence and social connections that made her feel increasingly comfortable in her new environment. The gradual transformation of Stephen's behavior began so subtly that Araceli initially dismissed warning signs as normal adjustment challenges faced by couples learning to live together while navigating cultural differences, practical demands of building a shared life. His questions about her daily activities, which had initially seemed like loving interest in her well-being, slowly evolved into detailed interrogations about her conversations with customers, her relationships with coworkers, and her use of time when he was away on long-haul trucking routes that kept him absent for weeks at a time. The isolation that Araceli began experiencing was both geographical and emotional, as Stephen's increasing possessiveness created barriers between her and the support networks she needed to thrive in her adopted country. His criticism of her English pronunciation, his dismissive comments about Filipino customs, and his growing resentment toward her desire to maintain connections with family in Manila gradually eroded her confidence, while making her question whether the problems in their marriage were somehow her fault for failing to adapt quickly enough to American expectations. The loneliness that consumed Araceli during Stephen's extended absences was compounded by his jealous reactions to any evidence that she had enjoyed social interactions or formed friendships during his time away, creating a psychological dynamic where she felt guilty for seeking the human connection that was essential for her emotional well-being. His accusations that she was ungrateful for the opportunities he had provided became increasingly frequent and vicious, transforming their conversations into emotional battlegrounds where her attempts to explain her feelings were met with rage and threats. The discovery of text messages between Araceli and Miguel Santos, a Filipino-American acquaintance who had offered her emotional support and cultural understanding during her darkest periods of homesickness and marital discord, would become the catalyst for the explosive violence that ended her life and shattered the dreams that had brought her halfway around the world in search of love and happiness. The Ninoy Aquino International Airport departure gate buzzed with the familiar chaos of Filipino families saying goodbye to loved ones embarking on journeys that would reshape their destinies. But for Araceli Mendoza, the emotional weight of leaving Manila carried additional significance as she prepared to board the flight that would carry her toward marriage with a man she had never physically met, despite months of digital courtship that had convinced her of their compatibility and shared vision for the future. The courtship between Araceli and Stephen Miller had begun through an international dating website where Stephen's profile had captured her attention with its emphasis on family values, financial stability, and genuine interest in finding a life partner who would appreciate the security and opportunities available in America. His photographs had depicted a pleasant-looking man with kind eyes and a warm smile, while his messages had demonstrated patience, humor, and what appeared to be sincere affection for her personality and aspirations, rather than mere physical attraction or exotic fantasy fulfillment. The video calls that had formed the foundation of their relationship had taken place during Stephen's rest periods between trucking routes, creating intimate conversations where they shared personal histories, cultural traditions, and dreams for their future together that had seemed to demonstrate genuine compatibility despite the vast differences in their backgrounds and life experiences. Araceli had been impressed by Stephen's willingness to learn basic Tagalog phrases and his respectful questions about Filipino customs, while he had expressed admiration for her work ethic, family loyalty, and optimistic outlook, despite the economic challenges that had motivated her decision to seek marriage with an American partner. The marriage visa application process had required extensive documentation, proving the authenticity of their relationship, including photographs from their video calls, copies of their message exchanges, and affidavits from friends and family members who could attest to their genuine intention to build a life together, rather than entering into a fraudulent arrangement for immigration purposes. Araceli had approached each requirement with meticulous attention to detail, recognizing that any mistake or inconsistency could result in visa denial and the destruction of her carefully planned escape from the limited opportunities available to young women in her economic circumstances. The financial investment that Stephen had made in their relationship, including payments for visa fees, travel expenses, and the costs associated with establishing a household suitable for his new bride, had seemed to demonstrate his serious commitment to their marriage, while also creating pressure for Araceli to prove herself worthy of his sacrifice and trust. His promises that she would be able to send money to support her family in Manila once she became established in America had addressed one of her primary concerns about leaving her homeland, while also creating expectations about her economic contributions to their household. The farewell gathering that Araceli's family had organized in the days before her departure had been bittersweet, combining celebration of her opportunity for a better life with anxiety about the risks associated with marrying someone whose true character remained largely unknown despite months of digital communication. Her mother's tears and repeated warnings about the dangers faced by Filipino women in foreign countries had been tempered by recognition that economic opportunities in Manila were unlikely to provide Araceli with the financial security and family stability that she desperately desired. The cultural preparation that Araceli had undertaken for her new life in America had included English language study, research about American customs and legal systems, and conversations with other Filipino women who had married foreign men and could provide practical advice about adaptation challenges and strategies for maintaining cultural identity while integrating into their husbands' communities. These preparations had strengthened her confidence, while also revealing the complexity of cross-cultural marriage and the importance of finding balance between honoring her heritage and embracing new traditions. The emotional state that Araceli experienced during her final hours in the Philippines combined excitement about her future possibilities with natural apprehension about leaving everything familiar and comfortable in exchange for the unknown challenges that awaited her in Jacksonville, where her success would depend entirely on Stephen's character and their ability to transform digital attraction into genuine marital partnership capable of weathering the inevitable difficulties that all couples faced. The flight to America represented more than geographical relocation for Araceli. It symbolized her transformation from a young woman, constrained by economic limitations and cultural expectations, into someone with agency to create her own destiny through marriage to a man who had promised to value her contributions, while providing opportunities for personal growth and family development that would honor both their individual aspirations and their shared commitment to building lasting happiness together. The Jacksonville apartment that Stephen Miller had prepared for his new bride reflected both his genuine desire to create a welcoming environment and his fundamental misunderstanding of the cultural sensitivity required to help someone from the Philippines feel comfortable and valued in their new American home. with decorations and furnishings that demonstrated good intentions, while revealing his limited knowledge of the emotional and practical needs that Araceli would experience during her transition period. The first weeks of their marriage unfolded with a honeymoon atmosphere that temporarily masked the personality differences and cultural disconnections that would later become sources of serious conflict, as both Araceli and Stephen made conscious efforts to present their best selves while learning to navigate the reality of sharing living space with someone whose habits, expectations, and communication styles had been shaped by completely different social environments and family traditions. Araceli's initial impressions of Stephen were largely positive, as he appeared patient with her English pronunciation mistakes, interested in learning about Filipino cuisine and customs, and committed to helping her establish independence through employment and social connections that would provide stability and friendship networks essential for successful adaptation to American life. His physical affection seemed genuine rather than possessive, and his pride in introducing her to neighbors and coworkers suggested that he viewed their marriage as a partnership rather than an ownership arrangement. The employment opportunity that Stephen had helped Araceli secure at a local retail store provided her with both financial independence and daily social interaction that proved crucial for her mental health and language development, while also giving her confidence that she could contribute meaningfully to their household expenses and begin sending modest amounts to support her family in Manila as she had promised before leaving the Philippines. The co-worker relationships that Araceli developed, particularly her friendship with Grace Lim, a second-generation Filipino-American who understood the cultural adjustment challenges that immigrant wives faced, provided emotional support and practical guidance that helped her navigate everything from banking procedures to healthcare systems while maintaining connection to her cultural heritage through shared language and traditional celebrations. The gradual changes in Stephen's behavior began during his first extended trucking route after their marriage, when his nightly phone calls evolved from loving check-ins to detailed interrogations about her daily activities, conversations with customers and coworkers, and use of time during his absence that revealed deep insecurity and possessiveness that he had successfully concealed during their courtship period when his behavior had been carefully managed to present an attractive image. The cultural misunderstandings that began emerging in their daily interactions reflected Stephen's underlying assumption that Araceli should rapidly abandon Filipino customs and communication styles in favor of complete assimilation to American norms, while she struggled to maintain her cultural identity and values without seeming ungrateful for the opportunities that her marriage had provided or disrespectful of his preferences and household rules. The first serious argument between Araceli and Stephen occurred when he discovered that she had been sending money to her family in Manila, despite their previous discussions about this responsibility that he had seemed to understand and support during their courtship, but now viewed as evidence that she prioritized her Filipino relationships over their American marriage financial goals. The emotional manipulation that Stephen employed during this conflict included accusations that Araceli was taking advantage of his generosity, threats to contact immigration authorities about their marriage arrangement, and cruel comments about Filipino women who supposedly used American men for financial gain while remaining emotionally committed to their homeland and previous relationships rather than building genuine partnerships with their husbands. The isolation that Araceli began experiencing was deliberately orchestrated by Stephen through his criticism of her friendships, his scheduling of social activities during times when he knew she had plans with coworkers, and his subtle but persistent undermining of her confidence in her English abilities and cultural adaptation that made her question whether she was failing to meet reasonable expectations for immigrant wives. The psychological impact of Stephen's increasingly controlling behavior was compounded by Araceli's recognition that her legal status in America depended on their marriage, creating a power dynamic where his threats about ending their relationship carried implications far beyond typical marital discord and could result in her forced return to the Philippines with the shame and financial consequences of a failed American marriage. The text messages that would ultimately cost Araceli Mendoza her life began as innocent expressions of homesickness and cultural confusion shared with Miguel Santos, a Filipino-American acquaintance who had offered friendship and guidance during her struggles to adapt to American life, while coping with Stephen's increasingly erratic and controlling behavior that made her question whether her marriage could survive the fundamental incompatibilities that were becoming impossible to ignore or rationalize. Miguel Santos had been introduced to Araceli through Grace Lim at a Filipino cultural event that Stephen had reluctantly allowed her to attend, and their initial conversations had focused on practical matters such as navigating American bureaucracy, maintaining cultural traditions, and finding Filipino groceries and services that could help her feel more connected to her heritage while building her new life in Jacksonville's small but supportive Filipino-American community. The emotional support that Miguel provided became increasingly important to Araceli as Stephen's trucking schedules grew longer and his behavior during their phone conversations became more hostile and suspicious, with accusations about her loyalty and fidelity that seemed to emerge from his own insecurities rather than any evidence of inappropriate behavior on her part or reasonable concerns about their relationship dynamics. The friendship between Araceli and Miguel remained entirely platonic and appropriate, consisting primarily of text message, conversations about cultural adaptation challenges, shared memories of the Philippines, and emotional support during particularly difficult periods when Stephen's verbal abuse and psychological manipulation made her feel isolated and uncertain about her ability to build a successful life in America while maintaining her dignity and cultural identity. The escalation of Stephen's controlling behavior during this period included demands that Araceli account for every moment of her time while he was away, restrictions on her social activities and friendships, and increasingly vicious verbal attacks about her supposed ingratitude and disloyalty that created a psychological environment where she felt guilty for seeking the emotional support that was essential for her mental health and stability. The work environment at the retail store where Araceli was employed provided temporary refuge from the emotional turmoil of her marriage, as her co-workers appreciated her friendly demeanor and strong work ethic, while remaining largely unaware of the domestic crisis that was developing in her personal life, though Grace Lim had begun noticing signs of stress and unhappiness that suggested serious problems in Araceli's relationship with Stephen. The cultural isolation that Araceli experienced was intensified by Stephen's criticism of Filipino customs and his demands that she prioritize American traditions and values over maintaining connections to her heritage, creating internal conflict between her desire to honor her husband's preferences and her need to preserve the cultural identity that provided meaning and stability during her adjustment to American life. The financial stress that developed in their marriage reflected Stephen's resentment about Araceli's modest contributions to her family in Manila, despite his previous assurances that he understood and supported this responsibility, and his growing demands that she demonstrate her commitment to their American future by completely severing financial and emotional ties to the Philippines and the people who had shaped her values and character. The psychological manipulation that Stephen employed included threats to end their marriage and pursue immigration proceedings that would result in Araceli's deportation, creating constant anxiety about her legal status and future, while also undermining her confidence in her ability to survive independently in America if their relationship deteriorated beyond repair, or if his threats about abandoning her were carried out. The text message, conversations between Araceli and Miguel that Stephen would eventually discover were filled with expressions of loneliness, confusion about American cultural expectations, and gratitude for having someone who understood her struggles without judging her for the difficulties she was experiencing in her marriage or questioning her commitment to building a successful life in her adopted country. The emotional intimacy that developed through these conversations remained entirely appropriate and focused on cultural support and friendship, but the frequency and personal nature of their communications would provide Stephen with the evidence he needed to justify the explosive rage and violent response that had been building through months of psychological deterioration, increasing paranoia about Araceli's loyalty and commitment to their marriage. The discovery that would trigger Stephen Miller's descent into murderous rage occurred on a humid Thursday evening in August, when he returned unexpectedly from a truncated trucking route to find Araceli's phone charging on their kitchen counter, displaying a notification from Miguel Santos that read, "Hope you're feeling better today." Innocent words that Stephen's increasingly paranoid and possessive mindset would interpret as evidence of betrayal that justified the explosive violence that had been building through months of psychological deterioration and jealous obsession. The confrontation that erupted when Stephen accessed Araceli's phone messages began with his demands for explanations about her relationship with Miguel, escalating rapidly into accusations of adultery and emotional infidelity that reflected his fundamental inability to understand that isolated immigrant women required cultural support and friendship networks to maintain their psychological stability while adapting to life in foreign countries with different social norms and expectations. Araceli's attempts to explain the innocent nature of her friendship with Miguel were met with Stephen's increasingly violent verbal abuse, including threats about her immigration status, cruel comparisons to other Filipino women who had supposedly betrayed their American husbands, and demands that she choose between maintaining any connections to Filipino culture and people or preserving their marriage and her legal right to remain in the United States. The psychological state that Stephen had reached by this point reflected months of accumulated resentment about cultural differences, financial pressures, and his own insecurities about Araceli's motives for marrying him, combined with paranoid fantasies about her emotional availability and commitment that had been fueled by his isolation during long trucking routes and his fundamental misunderstanding of cross-cultural marriage dynamics and immigrant adaptation needs. The escalation of Stephen's rage was triggered not only by the text messages themselves, but also by Araceli's refusal to apologize for seeking emotional support from someone who understood her cultural background and adjustment challenges, representing her first serious assertion of independence and dignity that challenged his assumption that gratitude for her American opportunities should translate into complete submission to his authority and preferences. The physical violence that Stephen employed against Araceli began with shoving and grabbing, that quickly escalated to slapping and punching as his rage overwhelmed any remaining self-control or recognition of moral boundaries that might have prevented him from seriously harming someone who was physically smaller and completely dependent on his protection and support in a foreign country where she had no family or legal resources. The neighbors in their apartment complex would later report hearing raised voices and sounds of struggle during the hours when Stephen's attack on Araceli was taking place, but cultural barriers and assumptions about domestic privacy prevented anyone from calling police or attempting to intervene in what they assumed was a typical marital argument rather than a life-threatening assault that was escalating toward murder. The final phase of Stephen's attack involved strangulation and blunt force trauma that demonstrated the complete breakdown of his psychological controls and his transformation from someone capable of maintaining social relationships and employment responsibilities into a person consumed by rage and jealousy that eliminated any consideration for human life or legal consequences that would inevitably follow his actions. The attempted concealment of evidence that Stephen undertook after killing Araceli revealed both his awareness that he had committed murder and his desperate but futile hope that he could avoid accountability by manipulating the crime scene and creating false narratives about her disappearance that would redirect suspicion away from domestic violence and toward theories about voluntary departure or random criminal activity. The discovery of Araceli's body by police officers responding to a welfare check requested by her worried coworkers at the retail store occurred 36 hours after Stephen had reported her missing, providing investigators with immediate evidence that contradicted his claims about the timeline and circumstances of her supposed departure from their apartment. The physical evidence that investigators collected from the crime scene included defensive wounds on Araceli's hands and arms that demonstrated her attempts to protect herself during Stephen's attack, DNA evidence under her fingernails that would conclusively link him to the assault, and blood spatter patterns that contradicted his statements about finding their apartment empty when he returned from his trucking route. Detective Paul Harris had investigated numerous domestic violence cases during his 23 years with the Jacksonville Police Department, but the murder of Araceli Mendoza presented unique challenges involving international immigration law, cultural sensitivity requirements, and the complex dynamics of cross-cultural marriage that required specialized knowledge and careful coordination with federal authorities who maintain jurisdiction over crimes involving foreign nationals and immigration fraud. Allegations. The initial interview with Stephen Miller revealed inconsistencies in his timeline and behavior that immediately raised suspicions about his involvement in Araceli's disappearance, including his failure to contact her family in the Philippines or her coworkers when she supposedly failed to return home, his detailed knowledge of her daily routines despite claiming to be surprised by her absence, and his inappropriate emotional responses that seemed calculated rather than genuine expressions of concern or grief. The investigation into Araceli's background and relationships required sensitive outreach to Jacksonville's Filipino-American community, where cultural barriers and immigration concerns initially created reluctance to cooperate with law enforcement, until Detective Harris established trust through respectful acknowledgement of community concerns and clear explanations about the investigation's focus on protecting immigrant women rather than scrutinizing their legal status or cultural practices. The forensic analysis of Araceli's phone revealed the complete context of her relationship with Miguel Santos, demonstrating that their communications were entirely appropriate and focused on cultural support rather than romantic involvement, while also providing evidence of Stephen's increasing psychological instability through his monitoring of her communications and his escalating demands for isolation from Filipino cultural connections and support networks. The witness testimony provided by Grace Lim and other co-workers painted a detailed picture of Araceli's emotional state during the months before her death, including her expressions of loneliness and confusion about American cultural expectations, her growing fear of Stephen's jealous reactions to her friendships, and her increasing isolation from support systems that could have provided protection or assistance during the escalation of domestic violence. The psychological profile that investigators developed for Stephen Miller revealed classic patterns of domestic abuse, including isolation tactics, financial control, cultural manipulation, and escalating verbal aggression that typically preceded physical violence in relationships, where immigration status created additional power imbalances between American citizens and foreign-born spouses who depended on marriage for legal residency rights. The physical evidence collected from Stephen's truck and personal belongings included traces of Araceli's DNA, blood evidence that contradicted his claims about the timeline of her disappearance, and financial records showing his research into legal procedures for reporting missing persons and claiming life insurance benefits that suggested premeditation rather than spontaneous violence triggered by discovering her text messages. The international cooperation required for the investigation included coordination with Philippine authorities, who provided background information about Araceli's family and personal history, verification of her immigration documents and marriage visa application, and assistance with notification procedures that respected cultural protocols, while ensuring that her family received accurate information about the circumstances of her death. The interrogation sessions with Stephen Miller documented his gradual psychological deterioration as evidence mounted against him, beginning with confident denials and evolving through desperate attempts to blame Araceli for provoking his violence, before finally culminating in partial confessions that revealed his distorted justifications for murder based on perceived betrayal and cultural conflicts that he could not resolve through communication or counseling. The legal proceedings against Stephen Miller were complicated by defense strategies that attempted to exploit cultural stereotypes about Filipino women and arranged marriages, requiring prosecutors to educate juries about the legitimate nature of international marriage arrangements, while also demonstrating that cultural differences never justified domestic violence or provided excuses for criminal behavior, regardless of the defendant's personal frustrations or perceived grievances. The victim advocacy efforts that emerged from Araceli's case included enhanced support services for immigrant women experiencing domestic violence, improved training for law enforcement officers investigating crimes involving foreign nationals, and community education programs designed to help Filipino Americans recognize warning signs of abuse while connecting potential victims with culturally sensitive resources and legal assistance. The trial of Stephen Miller for the murder of Araceli Mendoza began 18 months after her death, during which time Jacksonville's Filipino-American community had mobilized to ensure that her case received appropriate attention, while also advocating for systematic changes in domestic violence prevention and immigrant protection services that could prevent similar tragedies from occurring in their vulnerable population of recent arrivals and marriage visa recipients. The prosecution's case was methodically constructed around forensic evidence, witness testimony, and expert analysis of domestic abuse patterns that demonstrated Stephen's escalating control and violence, while refuting defense claims that Araceli's death resulted from spontaneous rage rather than the predictable culmination of systematic psychological and physical abuse that had been building for months before the final fatal confrontation. The defense strategy attempted to generate sympathy for Stephen by portraying him as a victim of deception who had been manipulated by a woman whose true intentions involved using their marriage for immigration benefits while maintaining her emotional commitments to other men, requiring prosecutors to counter these cultural stereotypes with evidence of Araceli's genuine efforts to build their marriage and her appropriate behavior throughout their relationship. The testimony provided by Miguel Santos was crucial for establishing the innocent nature of his friendship with Araceli, while also demonstrating the cultural isolation and emotional distress that had motivated her to seek support from someone who understood her adaptation challenges and could provide encouragement during particularly difficult periods of loneliness and cultural confusion. The expert witnesses who testified about domestic violence patterns and immigrant vulnerability provided essential context for understanding how Stephen's controlling behavior had systematically undermined Araceli's independence and self-confidence, while creating psychological conditions that made it difficult for her to recognize the escalating danger or seek help from law enforcement agencies that she feared might prioritize immigration enforcement over victim protection. The victim impact statements presented by Araceli's family in the Philippines, delivered through video testimony that required translation services, provided powerful evidence of her character and the devastating impact of her loss on relatives who had supported her decision to seek opportunities in America, while trusting that her marriage would provide safety and happiness, rather than the violence and death that destroyed their dreams for her future. The forensic evidence that proved most compelling to jurors included the defensive wounds on Araceli's body that demonstrated her attempts to protect herself during Stephen's attack, the DNA evidence that conclusively linked him to the assault, and the blood spatter analysis that contradicted his claims about discovering her body rather than causing her death through deliberate violence. The psychological evaluation of Stephen Miller revealed personality disorders and control issues that explained his inability to maintain healthy relationships while also demonstrating his capacity for manipulation and calculated behavior that undermined defense claims about temporary insanity or emotional disturbance that supposedly diminished his criminal responsibility for planning and executing Araceli's murder. The jury deliberation lasted 4 days, as members struggled with complex questions about cultural differences, immigration dynamics, and the degree of premeditation involved in Stephen's crimes, ultimately reaching unanimous verdicts on all charges, including first-degree murder, domestic violence, and obstruction of justice, that reflected their recognition of the systematic nature of his abuse and the deliberate character of his final attack. The sentencing phase focused on appropriate punishment that would reflect both the heinous nature of Stephen's crimes and their broader impact on immigrant communities who needed assurance that American legal systems would protect vulnerable foreign nationals from domestic violence, while holding American citizens accountable for exploiting power imbalances created by immigration status and cultural unfamiliarity. Stephen Miller received life imprisonment without possibility of parole, along with additional sentences for related charges that ensured he would never again have opportunities to harm immigrant women or exploit cultural differences for criminal purposes, while also sending clear messages to other potential perpetrators about the serious consequences of domestic violence against foreign nationals. The aftermath of Stephen Miller's conviction and sentencing created lasting changes in Jacksonville's approach to domestic violence prevention and immigrant support services, as community organizations and law enforcement agencies recognized the need for specialized resources that address the unique vulnerabilities faced by foreign-born women whose legal status and cultural isolation made them particularly susceptible to abuse by American citizens who understood how to exploit these power imbalances. The Araceli Mendoza Memorial Fund, established by Jacksonville's Filipino-American community, provided financial assistance for immigrant women seeking to escape domestic violence, while also supporting educational programs that taught recent arrivals about their legal rights, available resources, and warning signs of abusive relationships that might escalate to life-threatening violence, requiring immediate intervention from law enforcement or domestic violence specialists. The legislative initiatives inspired by Araceli's case included enhanced penalties for domestic violence crimes involving foreign nationals, mandatory cultural sensitivity training for law enforcement officers and court personnel, and improved coordination between immigration authorities and domestic violence agencies to ensure that victims could report abuse without fear of deportation or other immigration consequences that might prevent them from seeking help. The training programs developed for domestic violence counselors and victim advocates included specialized modules about cultural barriers that prevented immigrant women from recognizing abuse or seeking assistance, techniques for building trust with clients who feared law enforcement contact, and strategies for connecting victims with culturally appropriate support services that respected their religious and traditional values while providing practical assistance. The community outreach efforts that emerged from advocacy work included regular presentations at Filipino cultural events, partnerships with religious organizations that served immigrant populations, and multilingual educational materials that provided clear information about domestic violence laws, victim rights, and available resources in formats that were accessible to women with limited English proficiency or unfamiliarity with American legal systems. The policy changes implemented by Jacksonville Police Department included specialized training for officers responding to domestic violence calls involving foreign nationals, protocols for working with interpreters and cultural liaisons, and enhanced coordination with federal immigration authorities to ensure that criminal investigations could proceed without compromising victims' legal status or creating additional barriers to cooperation with law enforcement. The support services that were expanded in response to Araceli's case included culturally appropriate counseling programs, legal assistance for immigration issues related to domestic violence, temporary housing assistance for women, fleeing abusive relationships, and job training programs that helped survivors develop economic independence necessary for building safe and stable lives away from their abusers. The international cooperation that developed through advocacy efforts included partnerships with Philippine government agencies responsible for protecting overseas workers, information sharing agreements with other countries that had significant populations of women married to American citizens, and coordination with international human rights organizations that monitored violence against immigrant women in developed countries. The research initiatives that were funded through foundation grants and government programs contributed to enhanced understanding of cultural factors that influenced immigrant women's responses to domestic violence, while also advancing knowledge about effective intervention strategies and prevention programs that could protect vulnerable populations without undermining legitimate cultural traditions or family structures. The media coverage that continued to focus attention on Araceli's case included investigative reporting about gaps in domestic violence services for immigrant women, educational programming about warning signs of abuse in cross-cultural relationships, and feature stories about survivors who had successfully escaped violent marriages with assistance from culturally sensitive support services. The memorial services that were held annually on the anniversary of Araceli's death served multiple purposes, including honoring her memory, raising awareness about domestic violence in immigrant communities, and maintaining political pressure for continued improvements in prevention and support services that could protect other vulnerable women from experiencing similar violence and death. 5 years after Araceli Mendoza's murder, the impact of her case continued to influence domestic violence prevention efforts throughout Florida and other states with significant immigrant populations, as the systematic changes that had been implemented in response to her death demonstrated measurable improvements in protecting foreign-born women while also enhancing law enforcement capabilities for investigating and prosecuting crimes involving cultural manipulation and immigration-related power imbalances. The statistical analysis of domestic violence cases involving immigrant women showed significant increases in reporting rates and successful prosecutions following the implementation of culturally sensitive support services and law enforcement training programs that had been developed in response to advocacy efforts inspired by Araceli's case, and the recognition that traditional approaches were inadequate for protecting vulnerable foreign nationals. The expansion of support services to other Florida cities included replication of Jacksonville's successful programs, while also adapting strategies to meet the needs of different immigrant communities, including women from Latin America, Eastern Europe, and other Asian countries who faced similar vulnerabilities but required culturally specific approaches that respected their particular religious traditions, language needs, and family structures. The federal legislation that was influenced by advocacy efforts included enhanced protections for immigrant victims of domestic violence, improved coordination between immigration enforcement and victim protection agencies, and increased funding for programs that provided specialized services to foreign-born women experiencing abuse by American citizens who exploited their legal status and cultural unfamiliarity for control and manipulation. The educational initiatives that reached thousands of immigrant women included multilingual materials about domestic violence recognition and prevention, community workshops that provided practical information about legal rights and available resources, and peer support programs that connected recent arrivals with established community members who could provide guidance and assistance during adaptation challenges. The law enforcement improvements that resulted from enhanced training and policy changes included better investigation techniques for cases involving cultural barriers, improved coordination with victim advocates and interpreters, and more effective prosecution strategies that addressed defense attempts to exploit cultural stereotypes and immigration concerns to minimize criminal accountability for domestic violence. The international recognition that Araceli's case received included attention from human rights organizations, academic researchers studying violence against immigrant women, and policymakers in other countries who were developing their own approaches to protecting foreign nationals from domestic abuse while maintaining respect for cultural diversity and legitimate immigration processes. The ongoing support for Miguel Santos, who had struggled with guilt and trauma following Araceli's death, despite his complete innocence in contributing to the violence she experienced, included counseling services and community support that helped him process his grief, while also enabling him to become an advocate for domestic violence prevention and immigrant protection in honor of her memory. The family connections that were maintained between Araceli's relatives in the Philippines and Jacksonville's Filipino-American community created lasting bonds that supported memorial activities while also providing practical assistance for other families whose daughters were considering marriage to American citizens, including guidance about warning signs and protective strategies that could prevent similar tragedies. The research contributions that emerged from academic study of Araceli's case advanced understanding of cultural factors in domestic violence, while also contributing to improved training programs for professionals who worked with immigrant populations, enhanced prevention strategies that addressed community-specific vulnerabilities, and more effective intervention approaches that balanced cultural sensitivity with victim protection priorities. The policy advocacy that continued to focus on immigrant protection included ongoing efforts to strengthen legal remedies for domestic violence victims, improve coordination between agencies responsible for immigration and law enforcement, and maintain funding for specialized services that address the complex needs of foreign-born women experiencing abuse in cross-cultural relationships. 10 years after Araceli Mendoza's brutal murder transformed her American dream into a nightmare that ended in a blood-stained apartment in Jacksonville, her legacy lives on through the countless immigrant women who have been protected by the domestic violence prevention programs, legal reforms, and community support services that emerged from the tragedy of her death, and the determination of advocates who refused to let her suffering be forgotten or her killer's actions go unanswered. The Araceli Mendoza Center for Immigrant Women's Safety, established with funding from federal grants and community donations, has provided direct services to over 3,000 women, while also training hundreds of law enforcement officers, counselors, and victim advocates in culturally sensitive approaches that recognize the unique vulnerabilities faced by foreign-born individuals experiencing domestic violence in their adopted countries. The legislative changes that were influenced by her case continue to protect immigrant victims through enhanced legal remedies, improved coordination between agencies, and specialized court procedures that address cultural barriers while ensuring that foreign nationals receive equal protection under American law, regardless of their immigration status or English proficiency levels. The international cooperation that developed through advocacy efforts has created networks of support that span multiple countries and cultures, providing resources for women considering international marriage, while also offering assistance for those who discover that their dreams of love and opportunity have been exploited by individuals who view foreign wives as possessions, rather than partners deserving respect and protection. The community healing that occurred within Jacksonville's Filipino-American population demonstrated the resilience and solidarity that can emerge from tragedy when cultural groups unite to protect their most vulnerable members, while also working to educate others about the warning signs of abuse and the importance of maintaining support networks that can provide assistance during crisis situations. The memorial garden that was planted in Araceli's honor at Jacksonville's Filipino Cultural Center serves as a peaceful space for reflection and remembrance, while also providing a venue for educational events about domestic violence prevention and immigrant women's rights that continue to raise awareness about the issues that contributed to her death and the ongoing need for vigilance in protecting vulnerable community members. Stephen Miller remains incarcerated at Florida State Prison, where his appeals have been consistently denied by courts that have found no merit in his claims about inadequate legal representation or cultural bias in his prosecution. While prison records indicate that he has shown no genuine remorse for his crimes and continues to blame Araceli for supposedly provoking the violence that ended her life and destroyed both their families, the ripple effects of Araceli's murder continue to influence American immigration policy discussions about protecting foreign spouses from domestic violence, while also maintaining legitimate security concerns about marriage fraud, creating ongoing debates about balancing enforcement priorities with victim protection that require nuanced understanding of cultural dynamics and power imbalances in cross-cultural relationships. Grace Lim, who had been Araceli's closest friend and confidant during her final months, became a prominent advocate for immigrant women's rights and established a nonprofit organization that provides emergency assistance and legal support for foreign-born victims of domestic violence, ensuring that Araceli's legacy includes practical help for women facing similar dangers in their American marriages. The story of Araceli Mendoza serves as a permanent reminder that cultural diversity and international marriage can create beautiful opportunities for love and family building, but these same differences can also be exploited by individuals who view foreign spouses as vulnerable targets for control and abuse, rather than equal partners deserving respect, protection, and the chance to pursue their dreams safely in their adopted homeland. Her memory lives on through every immigrant woman who finds safety through the programs established in her honor, every law enforcement officer who receives training about cultural sensitivity in domestic violence cases, and every community member who learns to recognize and respond to the warning signs that might prevent another bright young woman's American dream from becoming a deadly nightmare that destroys families and communities on both sides of the Pacific Ocean.